Anyone who's ever spent a meaningful chunk of their life in the MMO or online RPG ecosystem develops a certain kind of survival instinct, an ability to sniff out slop, no matter how shiny or opaque the packaging is, a kind of sixth sense that activates before you even touch the game. Sometimes all it takes is a bullet point feature list, and suddenly you're having war flashbacks to a dozen other titles that promised the world and delivered a coupon for 10% off your next disappointment. I believe scientists call this pattern recognition, and we all know the pattern by now. Free to play, cross-platform with mobile, a bloated, cluttered UI with way too many menus that ping you with red notification dots that breed faster than fruit flies, daily login reward trackers to keep you coming back, optional freemium subscriptions, many times several of them at the same time, time gating and energy systems that bottleneck content, auto-pathing to quests and points of interest, and speaking of quests, way too many of those too. And of course, the global release that is permanently behind the original region in the content schedule. You don't even have to have all of these together. The presence of just a handful of these features seen in an upcoming release of an online service game will be enough to evoke a groan out of most of us, because these are all indicative of a game that's just like the others. Mining canaries loudly signaling this is another grindy and punishing waste of time. And it's not because we're just cynical, it's probably because 10 out of 10 times it ends up being true, and the game ends up siphoning out a lot more value than it ever provides. That's why it's so refreshing to so many people that Where Winds Meet is different. It's so successful, but it has every single one of those features. Every single one. For all intents and purposes, it shares its DNA with some of the genre's most notorious failures. Maybe this is why IGN gave the game a 6 out of 10. They saw all the familiar patterns, all the typical red flags, and immediately dismissed the game as another name in a pile of identical slop. Dismissed it a little too soon, I fear, but I suppose that's what happens when the priority isn't analysis, but rather feeding into an echo chamber. Whoops. So why is Where Winds Meet the exception? What does it have buried deep and far inside of it that makes it stand out? As it turns out, none of these things ended up being mining canaries of anything bad. Surprisingly, they were not mining canaries at all. And the short, almost anticlimactic answer to why this game works is deceptively simple. It's fun. Cross-platform support with mobile and auto-pathing to quests and points of interest are usually some of the loudest canaries that signal that the game ahead is a mobile game by design that just happens to have a PC client. Veteran MMO players see those words and instantly assume they're about to enter a shallow, checklist-driven theme park set in a world built to be consumed as quickly and efficiently as possible. These features almost always signal the same thing: a shortened, bite-sized world designed around mobile constraints, where exploration is reduced to tapping glowing icons on a minimap rather than discovering anything meaningful on your own. As much as auto-pathing can be a convenient way to animation cancel going to the bathroom, more often than not, it's a developer self-report. We put in auto-pathing because our world is just not worth exploring. No reason to follow the journey from point A to point B because we can assure you there's just fucking nothing there. Cross-platform with mobile typically exists because, let's be honest, the PC client is just a bonus to pull in more players. And autopathing, harmless as it is on its own, is wildly hated because it usually signals the very likely existence of a myriad of other mobile game features. Neither of these things scream depth or immersion or handcrafted storytelling. Naturally, one wouldn't blame a player for expecting the same thing from Where Winds Meet. However, instead of the shallow, copy-pasted landscape everyone expected, the world is stunning. And I don't mean just visually, because visuals in modern Eastern games are hardly a flex anymore. The world is textured, layered, and feels like an actual place. The kind of place where you get distracted by something in the distance and soon realize that everything your eyes can see, your character can get to. And before you know it, you've wandered off your original path entirely because something just pulled you there. Exploration in Where Winds Meet feels less like running from point A to point B and more like getting sidetracked in Elden Ring. Everything from a pebble on the path to a distant rooftop feels like it has intent behind it. Some small narrative thread tying it to the region around it. Everything is interconnected, and typically the most random narrative goes far deeper than you expected. It's an environment that invites curiosity instead of streamlining it. You're not following waypoints because the game demands it. You're doing it because you have no idea what might be behind just over that hill. Every step of the way, there's a new trinket, a new item, a new point of interest, a new NPC that says something completely random that you remember 3 days later in a callback during a story cutscene. Players came in expecting a shallow world full of checklists, and instead they got an actual adventure. One where they chose the detours. Where Winds Meet has autopathing, yes, but truth be told, players rarely ever use it, not only because it didn't turn out to be the bad omen, but because there's no need to streamline traveling when it feels like an actual journey. They're given the option on their own terms, with a confidence that they won't be using it to condense the world because they will be naturally drawn to explore, because they want to, not because a quest told them to. So those two weren't canaries for anything. Good. Free-to-play models, daily logins, and totally optional freemium subscriptions are usually the holy trinity of heinous monetization. Veteran MMO players know exactly what they tend to signify. A game designed around purposeful inconveniences, and so they brace for impact. Time to figure out if fun is worth the suffering. And the degree of it varies from game to game, of course, but it usually goes something like this. Freemiums are almost always advertised as harmless and completely optional, just an extra boost if you want it. But anyone who's even remotely familiar with these kinds of games knows the truth. These freemiums shaped the way content interacts with the player based on their monetary contribution, their monetary value to the developers. Not paying the price for that totally optional freemium? No worries. You'll still be paying a price. Just instead of money, you'll be paying in grinding for less experience, a lower drop rate, a smaller inventory, fewer rewards, limited auction house transactions, higher sales taxes, more scarce materials, less gold, less loot, less friends, less bitches, smaller house, older, less fun. But it's fair because you see, you can still touch those things. So technically, nothing is locked behind paywalls. In other words, the game isn't designed with enjoyment as the core goal. It's designed around withholding enjoyment until you pay to remove all the tiny, persistent inconveniences weighing you down. The freemium becomes less of a choice and more of a hostage negotiation. Pay up to stop suffering. Daily login rewards tend to follow a similar philosophy. They're not there to reward you, they're there for you to not feel guilty for not claiming them. The rewards are usually just tempting enough that missing a day feels like you failed a contractual obligation. They're psychological shackles dressed up as generosity. So under normal circumstances, seeing all of these systems in a game like Where Winds Meet should have been another immediate groan moment, and for some it was, but then you play the game for a few seconds longer than IGN did and you realize that none of that doom actually ever materializes. Because in Where Winds Meet, every piece of content, every reward, every objective is available to free players in the same volume, quality, and power as it is to paying players. There is a startling and almost suspicious absence of pay-to-win mechanics, not just in the game design itself, but it's unattainable even through RMT, which is practically unheard of. The freemium pass doesn't unlock shortcuts or power boosts or exclusive advantages. It hands out a few consumables that the game already showers you with for free, plus cosmetics that are genuinely just cosmetics. No stats, no hidden modifiers, no oops, this outfit also increases your drop rate just a little bit nonsense. None of that. It doesn't feel shady, and more importantly, it doesn't feel purposely punishing for not engaging with it. Free players aren't shoved into the corner like second-class citizens for refusing to subscribe. Paying players just get outfits and like a couple more potions and some rocks and lint fuzz. And if you want those outfits, great. You're buying flair, not freedom from discomfort. Buying the freemium in Where Winds Meet feels like a reward for enjoying the game that you bought on your own terms because you were already enjoying the game enough to do it, not something that you do out of frustration to avoid that frustration. which is a refreshing reversal compared to most other specimen in the genre. Even the daily logins take a different approach. Meet's daily items are very trivial, things you'll find around the world in abundance, and if you miss a few days, you can still get the rewards for the days that you missed based on your activity level. So even in that trivial daily tracker, the FOMO is minimized completely. It feels like an actual extra little reward instead of an obligation just to not miss out. And as such, players who were bracing for impact, for limitations and caveats for being free to play, were shown like kindness by the developers, like that fucking mercy meme. And with that, another batch of potential canaries gets crossed out. Time gating and bottlenecking of content and global being consistently behind the original region in content are usually just the daily login problem in a different outfit. They serve the same purpose, a way to create artificial FOMO to ensure consistent logins and playtime, which pads the stats devs can present to investors in their quarterly circle jerks. These systems aren't designed to help players pace themselves. They're designed to make sure you show up every day, even when you don't want to. And they almost always function as a trap. Miss a day and you feel punished, play every day and you feel chained. It's a perfect loop of damned if you do, damned if you don't, sunk cost fallacy disguised as game design. In most MMOs, the situation gets even worse once steep gear score or power thresholds enter the picture. Suddenly, every single daily, every disposable time-limited event, every energy-limited dungeon becomes mandatory, not because it's fun, but because if you don't keep up, you might fall behind the curve. And being behind the curve means getting rejected from groups, which causes you to fall even further behind, until the rolling boulder of pay-to-win microtransactions inevitably catches up with you. And when the global version is behind the original region, it only intensifies the anxiety. Players in those kinds of games watch roadmaps or read patch notes of the OG region through a lens of, how do I strategically min-max my life for the next 3 months so I don't get left behind when this patch drops? It turns excitement into homework before the content even makes it to our region. Recently, Meet China got a major content update, the first one since the global version launched, and the players can't stop buzzing about it. You see, the energy system exists in Meet, yes, but it regenerates so slowly that it's essentially the opposite of a daily treadmill. The game isn't nudging you to log in every day, it's almost encouraging you not to log in just to do content that gives you gear. Because the content tied to energy gives you predictable, targeted rewards. You choose your gear set, you progress in a straight line without aggressive RNG that decides if an entire week's worth of work just went down the drain or not. More importantly, the entire game is structured without the typical group content pressure cooker. The content that requires energy is a drop in an ocean of other stuff to do in the game, and frankly, the thing that many players find the most fun, bosses, are solo content that you can do with friends if you want to, but you don't have to, and honestly, it's more fun without them. You don't need them. You don't need friends, trust me. Fuck them. There's no meta arms race pushing players to grind endlessly just to remain eligible for group invites. Best in slot gear is a chase objective that stems purely out of personal desire to do it, and not even a little bit out of necessity. And then there's a difficulty system, a godsend for a community traumatized by MMO gear score gatekeeping. If you want to challenge yourself, you can crank the difficulty up. If you want a breezier ride, you can bring it down. That completely trivializes the pursuit of good gear, leaving the option, again, in the player's hands. Someone playing on Legend difficulty doesn't need the best gear to beat everything, because the combat skill ceiling is high enough that a casual player will find it pretty fun on average, and a good player can outperform their items, which means progression isn't tied to fear, it's tied to personal enjoyment, whether that enjoyment comes from freedom or casual play, or ambition. The end result is a complete inversion of the usual MMO psychology. Instead of waking up every day thinking, if I don't grind, I'll fall behind, players think, I'll play when I feel like it. And ironically, for that very reason, they tend to play a lot more, because they're doing it willingly. Seeing the Chinese server ahead doesn't spark anxiety, it sparks curiosity. Updates feel like things to look forward to and not deadlines to prepare for. Players came in expecting a familiar nightmare, steep RNG gating, artificial scarcity, and a constant pressure to keep grinding out of fear rather than joy. Instead, they found a game that lets them approach its enormous ocean of content entirely on their own terms, at their own pace, for their own reasons. Wouldn't expect any less out of a 6 out of 10 game, honestly. An overwhelming number of quests is usually another classic red flag. In most MMOs, it's not a sign of depth, it's a sign of pointless padding. A wall between you and the real content. Again, everyone knows the pattern. The game doesn't actually start until max level, and everything between level 1 and then is an obstacle course of mediocre writing, unvoiced NPCs, and boring kill quests stitched together during the final sprint to launch. The result is that players, out of habit, learn to treat quests as a chore, not something to experience, but something to clench your teeth through as fast as humanly possible. From level 1, the mindset becomes skip everything, sprint to the endgame. Why? Because the endgame is usually rigorous, demanding, and unforgiving, especially in free-to-play titles, especially for somebody who doesn't have any subscriptions. There's no time to savor anything because FOMO and steep progression looms over your shoulder like tax auditors. It becomes muscle memory. Skip dialogue, skip cutscenes, skip story. It's all just a glorified distance barrier between you and the content that actually matters. And when the world itself is shallow, filled with teleports, autopathing, and empty stretches of terrain that exist purely to pad travel time, quests lose any residual value they might have ever had. If the journey isn't immersive, why pay attention to the signposts on the way? So in most MMOs, nobody bothers. The questing experience is a speedrun to unlock the stuff the players actually care about. I mean, sure, sometimes the premise of the story can be decent, but if they didn't bother pacing it in an interesting way, didn't bother telling the entire story through something that isn't just a block of unvoiced text on the screen, why should the players show more respect to the content than the devs ever did? Where Winds Meet also presents you with a main story quest and frankly a myriad of quests, side stories, random encounters, blurbs, lore items, whatever. They give you the option to skip it all if you want, but if you choose not to, it's presented in an interesting way. So many players actually choose not to skip it. Because first of all, when progression isn't tied to punishing gear checks, you stop treating quests as a barrier. Where Winds Meet doesn't shove players into an anxiety-driven grind cycle, so there's no incentive to rush through anything. The world is already fun from the moment you spawn in. You're not chasing relief, you're exploring because you feel like it. Characters grab your attention right away. They're realistic enough to fit within the setting, but appealing enough to catch the eye. The environment pulls you forward on its own terms, and the wuxia fantasy, rich, dramatic, full of both myths and Chinese history, does the rest. Without the pressure of an endgame treadmill, players approach the story with curiosity rather than impatience. They actually give it a chance. And when they do, they quickly find out the characters are fully voiced. Not just the main story, but a surprising number of side quests as well, with animated cutscenes and performances that actually feel alive, NPCs that change expressions and move around instead of standing still and plainly speaking. NPCs that were never meant to be in any major story or event will still tell you something that relates to the rest of the intertwining roots of this game's storytelling. The world doesn't demand your time, it lets you enjoy it the way you want to. And if you started off skipping the story, I can guarantee you there will be a boss fight so theatrical and intense that it will at least make you wonder about what you skipped over. The agency over pacing, the ability to wonder, to explore, to follow your interests rather than a checklist is what seals it. Where Winds Meet's quests are many, but they don't exist to slow you down. They exist to enrich a world that's already doing most of the heavy lifting. They're supplements, not barriers. Players typically expect quests to be a mandatory slog separating them from meaningful content. Instead, what they come to discover is that the content is meaningful from the start, and the quests simply give it a little bit more texture. Another red flag crossed off. And that leaves us with the last item on the list of red flags of mining canaries, the one thing that stubbornly refuses to be crossed off. The UI. Where Winds Meet's UI is bloated. It's a labyrinth of menus that sometimes feels like it was designed by 5 different teams who never once emailed each other. I got nothing for this one. No, well, actually, if you look closer, this is intentional genius. No, it's just bad. And that's fine. Because the UI being a mess doesn't undo everything else that the game does really well. In a way, it actually highlights the bigger truth behind Where Winds Meet's success. The game has flaws that are not only unavoidable, but sometimes frustrating. And yet, And this is something IGN failed to understand. It doesn't fucking matter, because people weren't waiting for a perfect game. Perfection has never been the issue. Players have endured janky physics, bugged quests, messy launches, lag spikes, server queues, bloated UI, and much, much more for decades, when the game underneath was worth it. The problem with modern online games hasn't been their small imperfections. It's been the core of the game just not being fucking fun. Players got tired of fun being treated like a finite resource to ration out. You can enjoy this if you buy the premium pass. You can progress, but if you log in every day. You can compete, but only if you pay to skip the suffering we intentionally baked into the game. You can play, but only on our terms. Bitch, no one wants that! Where Winds Meet, UI disaster and all, does the opposite. It gives players a world that's fun at its core, not fun with conditions. Just fun. People just want a game that is confident enough in the quality of its content to not employ bullshit tactics. A game that is good enough in enough ways to give players the respect and integrity to not swindle them and try to sell them snake oil, and confidently expect their full support and continued interest. They just needed a game that respected them enough to stop treating them like children who can't be trusted with their own time. Who would have thought that adults wanted to be treated as adults?